Welcome to Liz McMullen Show, the Retrospective series. This is the very first one, and I have invited J.M. Redmann to come on as my debut of me reviewing an entire body of work. So, Jean, thank you for being my test subject.
Okay. Test and debut. That's not usually the way I fall into things, but what the hell?
Thank you for being so gracious. So, one of the things that I'd like to start off with, early mystery or crime fiction, however you like to refer to it, there weren't a hell of a lot of presses going on when you started. And one of the first series that I ever read was by Catherine B. Forrest.
Yeah.
So when did you come upon writing, and how did Micky Knight come to you?
Well, I mean, there were multiple different things going on, and we all come out of the culture that is around us. You know, we build on who comes before us, and that's why I always tell people, you've got to read. If you want to write a book, you need to read the kind of books you want to write. Obviously, around this time, you know, this is so long ago, because my first book came out in 1990, and I was writing it in, like, 1988, that there were Sarah Paretsky, Sue Grafton, Marcia Muller. You know, there was this suddenly huge awakening in terms of, oh, women can be that icon. They can be the lone wolf, the private detective. We can start being the heroes as opposed to the girlfriends or the sidekicks or the villainesses or whatever. And I looked at those books, and there was also that coming like Catherine Forrest was starting to write. Sarah Dreyer was writing. Ellen Hart and others like that. There was starting to be this little lesbian mystery thing. It's almost like in the beginning, a lot of the books, Barbara Wilson, they were all writing these books, and Catherine Forrest was doing a police procedural. Ellen Hart, Barbara Wilson, and Sarah Dreher were all what we call cozies. In other words, their characters were amateurs. Ellen's was a restaurateur. Sarah Dreher was a travel agent. And so those were going on. I thought, I want to read about the private detective. I want, the lone wolf, that sort of stuff, walking the mean streets. And that's when I looked in the mirror and said, well, maybe you should try and write that, because why the fuck not? I mean, who else is out there doing it? And so it sort of like, it started kind of as a bit of a dare to myself. I was, in my 20s, I was young, and just sitting down. She started as a short story, and if you look at the first book structurally, you can kind of see the way that goes. I mean, amateur mistakes. And I just got interested in the character and sat down, just wrote it, and I thought, I will read it, and 5 of my friends will read it, maybe, if they're really friendly, and that's sort of going to be it. But I had this manuscript, and so I thought, well, what the hell, there are a number of these small little presses, and let me just send something out to one and just see what the hell happens. And I got a couple rejects, and New Victoria, I think they're about the 4th or 5th one I sent it out to, and they said, sure, we'll publish it. And I was like, really? Really? Are you sure? But, they were really small press, and that's sort of how she started.
One of the things that I find unique about Micky is her circle of friends, and how at times strained and awful their relationships are, and how and she doesn't answer her phone a lot, and she kind of falls off the side of the map a lot, and she's got friends like Joanne, which is kind of like putting your hand in a blender. Sometimes they're not really good together, and Danny's got that chip on her shoulder because of like the way that their love affair had ended so many years ago. So it's a very different cast of characters for Micky. Sometimes they're supportive, sometimes they suck.
Yeah. Well, as a writer, I mean, what are the choices you have to make as a writer? Now, in our real life, we run into just a huge coterie of people, and sometimes they float in and they float out with, kind of a seemingly randomness. You've got a good friend at work, but they they get married, or they get another job someplace, or they decide to go back to graduate school, and then they life changes in this way that just is sort of, just the way it happens. But when you're writing a book, you have to make dramatic choices, and you have to have, if you bring a character in, you have to kind of keep that character in. So like I said, I deliberately, particularly in the first book, wanted to make Mickey, a real bit of a jerk. That she's not necessarily likable, but she's interesting, and that was what I was trying to do, and I hope that I did that. And again, one of the reasons as a writer I made that choice was that someone who is really got issues and problems and is flawed is more interesting to write about, I felt, just because the journey that they're on has to be, they have much further to go. So you've got a lot of dramatic area that you can cover with them. And, some of the friends initially were kind of like, well, how do I get her to do this, this kind of story plot? Oh, well, I'm going to need someone who's a police officer. How do I get these other things? And so they sort of came out of that, who would she know? And as you probably know, sometimes the circles that are subcircles of society, and particularly back when I started doing that, even to today to some extent, if you're lesbian, LGBTQ, you oftentimes will have friends that you wouldn't normally contact. You might find, if you're straight, you find your friends at work, you find your friends at your church, whatever, because you're acceptable there. If you're queer, you may not be able to find your friends in places like that. You may not even go in places like that. So you go to, I don't know, the lesbian book club or the lesbian bar or whatever, and you meet just a whole different segment of people.
One of the things that I like about Mickey's arc is that there's this term that in education where you say learning is recursive, which means just because you picked it up once doesn't mean you won't lose it and have to be reintroduced to it again. And I feel like Mickey's arc is recursive in that she grows and then she screws up, falls on her face, or for whatever reason finds herself back on square one again. And I know that you got some heat when you kind of yanked the happily ever after out of the plot, her plot line. But I was kind of happy because I like Mickey messy. I like her dysfunctional. She was getting really domesticated to the point where in one book she was the unappreciated spouse who's doing all the cooking and the cleaning and who's like doctor wife is always, off in the clouds. So I kind of liked that she jumped off that train or was kicked out of that train. So.
Yeah, well, yes, I did get some heat of that. And it's one of the challenges of how do you do a series and how do you keep that dramatic tension? How do you keep, so many things up in the air? And Locke sort of played with this idea. There was, I'm not going to name names here, but there was just a swath of lesbians, who were full of angst because their girlfriend had just died, their partner, whatever. And there were so many little widow lesbians running around and some of this stuff and explaining this. And I always felt like, you cheated because we never saw a relationship. We never saw this. It's just a quick sort of shortcut to why is my character, so angsty? It's because her lover died. And now she's dealing with the aftermath of that. Sometimes I felt it's
shorthand.
It's not quite as realistic it should be, and you set it up as just sort of this almost throwaway thing that you wanted to create about this person. And I have to fully admit, I was really toying with the idea. I was teetering on the edge of after ill will is do I kill her off?
Because Cordelia had cancer.
Yeah, she was ill, and there was definitely, we left it at hanging there, and I had thought about it, said, well, maybe I should do this, maybe let's jump over this cliff that no one else has jumped over before. And that's what I've tried to do with the character. One of the things that I did early in the books was, again, reading other books. Oftentimes we talk about people who are victims of abuse, of sexual abuse. And I looked at the kind of situation I put Micky into, and I said, yeah, she's going to be abused. Because I read these books, and it was always the best friend, it was always the victim. The heroes were never, ever the victims of abuse. The ones who wanted to identify the white knights, the ones who were the lead in the story, weren't. And I thought, there's something wrong with that, because that's a fallacy. It says that if you're really good enough, if you're really strong enough, you should be able to get away from it. You shouldn't have this happen to you. And I think we all know that's not true. There's just no way out of it for particularly people in certain vulnerable circumstances. No matter who you are, how strong, how resilient you are, you can't get out of it. Because one of the things I had to think about with her was, okay, what would make a woman decide to want to be a private eye? How do you, because the men just came into this sort of fully formed, but it's, for the woman, it was like, okay, what kind of person would choose this as a career? What kind of person would want to, it's a small business. She's on her own. She's sort of flying, particularly in the first books. She's sort of eking out a living through it, not doing really that well. And what kind of person would choose this? And so I had to come up with what kind of character would do that. And it came to probably be someone who was a loner and in some ways damaged. And again, that tied into who is she as a person and what kind of journey is she on. Jumping forward, I felt like, okay, we've broken that. Let's see if I dare. And, then I started thinking about it. It's like, well, I write, realistic, noir. I'm not into vampires or fantasies. That's not what's going on in these books. And so if I kill her off, she's dead. We're not bringing Spock back this time. And so I had...
it's messier to keep her in the picture but not in the picture, even if she's off camera.
Right.
And she's... I was very angsty at the end of your most recent Edge of Summer. And I was, oh man, that sucks. But in real life, other than me, for some reason, all the people that I've dated, whenever I stop dating them, they are no longer around. Usually I date somebody from not in the area or whatever. But in most people's lives, they encounter their exes on occasion, if not too much. One of the funnier scenes that you wrote was Micky, and I think it was a red dress that she went as the housewarming for Alex and Joanne, and she found out that of all the people in the room, I think it was Ellie was the only one that she hadn't slept with. She's like, well, should we get that over with?
Yeah. Which is, again, it's stretching it a bit in terms of writer. Yes, we do have these messy, sometimes messy dyke drama, and the saying here in New Orleans is, eventually you get all your furniture back. Like, wait, that chair I gave, no, wait, you got it from, and then she got, that's how it came back here. So yeah, that's again, but playing it up, but. As a writer, again, we go a little bit over the top. We go a little bit further than real life is sometimes going to get you, at the same time keeping it within what is believable, so we can't go into the really absurd things that life sometimes throws at you.
Yeah, sometimes, that label, truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah. Because
the majority of your books, except, I don't know, are your new books also in New Orleans?
They're set in a fictional Mississippi Gulf Coast town.
Okay. So, one of the things, and I don't know if we'd call it... Okay, I'll just call it my worldview, is that, I grew up in New Jersey, and New York City was what I considered a city.
Yeah. And it's a city.
Yeah. But New Orleans, I never... I guess because it didn't fit what my archetype of a city, I never thought of it that way. But as I read your series, and also I've been there, I'm like, yeah, just because, that they don't have all these skyscrapers except in the central business district.
Yeah.
CBD, doesn't mean it's not a big city. And
Yeah.
which actually, this
Yes.
parlays into something else that, I was like Mickey not being so smart in the cold, thinking that all the criminals are not about at the time, and then getting like, a little kid who ends up trying to bang bang, make her
Yeah.
stop, but he has no real gun. Um, and I was like, oh yeah, that is, a city. Yeah, you have to walk in a certain way so you don't seem like either a tourist or a victim. That's something that's true in New York City. And in New Orleans, there are a lot of port city problems as well. But it took a while for me to wrap my brain around New Orleans being big city.
Yeah, it's not a big city. It's a medium sized to smaller city. It's we can look at maybe 1.5 million people in the metropolitan area, and that's much smaller compared to New York. It's there are smaller cities, but it's certainly a city in terms of concentration of urbanness. And in again some of the stuff that goes on, there's high rates of poverty, there's high rates of crime, and so it's a very very different city than New York. New York is this dense, bubbling, just energetic, frantic energy type city, and I love New York. I lived there for 10 years, but New Orleans is this whole different city in ways. It's probably the least American of any city on the American continent. It's got a whole different. There's a cultural background that's very different. This is a city that was built on the French and Spanish rule. We operate under Napoleonic code. We do not operate under what they call civil code. I mean, it's very similar, but Death of a Dying Man, particularly some of the nuances of Napoleonic code played into how the plot of that book spun out. So and if you've been here, you recognize that this is a city that just has a whole different outlook on life. Yeah, it's not tall buildings. There are scattering of them in the central business district. The French Quarter is probably the largest historical, complete whole historical area where you can walk for block and block and block, and there's all the buildings are historic. They go back to whatever the last fire was that destroyed the French Quarter. And few other cities have that. And then, as you say, the river. We were in Australia. My partner's Australian. We were there once, and we were going by the mighty Murray, which is the largest river there. And I just sort of looked at her, and said, "You call this a river?" And she was like, "Yeah, you're right," because she's seen the Mississippi. It brings
huge.
Yeah, yes. And what people don't realize about Mississippi, and I'll go on a little bit of soapbox here, is people are, well, Katrina, get rid of New Orleans, just what? It's like, no, you can't. You can't do that. The Mississippi River is to bring the huge ocean-going ships up the Mississippi River. You can bring them to about New Orleans, because the river is this huge, deep trough to about 300 feet here. And then once you get a little bit past New Orleans, it starts to go up. Now, it's still a big, mighty river and a lot of stuff, but the huge ocean-going vessels cannot go much further up than New Orleans. And so if you lose New Orleans, you lose the port at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And most people don't even think about that because they're not aware of, how much, oil and all that. So, you guys want heating oil in the winter? Guess what? You want the Mississippi River to be able to have a huge deep water port at it. You want your grain and stuff to go out to the world, you got to have this kind of port in the Mississippi River.
So one of the things that was interesting is, talking about New Orleans as an ecosystem of some sort, and that they're during winter's smug season.
Yeah, it's a little chilly here right now, but on Tuesday it'll be 70 degrees here. And so when my friends up in the north, I got a blizzard. It's 3 feet of snow and wind chill, and we can't get out of our house. I'm like, oh, it's 70 degrees here, and we call it our smug season.
Well, I think it. Well, it had to be February since Illy and I. Her birthday is on the 12th, and
Uh-huh.
Valentine's is actually on the 14th. So a lot of times when we'd celebrate a holiday, we'd celebrate at that time. And we came to New Orleans,
Yeah.
and it was a spate of cold weather, and we were having difficulty finding shops where we could buy clothes that would be warmer, because even though the temperature isn't way low, the moisture level,
Oh, yeah, the humidity.
yes. And the thing is, I lived in Dublin for a year. I went to school there. And even though it never got nearly as cold as my college, which Mount Holyoke in western Berkshires of Massachusetts is snow cold,
Yes.
I could never wear a wool sweater there because you just like end up sweating. But in Ireland, you really needed it because of all the moisture in the air. And
I know.
so when I was
Yeah.
reading one of your books, I was like, yeah, that's fucking cold. It may not be like below zero, but the dampness, ugh.
Oh, I know. People are like, oh, 40 degrees, it's not that bad. We're in Wisconsin and it's zero. And like, first of all, you don't know again, the humidity. There's a difference between 40 degrees and 80% humidity and 0 degrees and 2% humidity. And the second thing, too, is the infrastructure down here is built for summer. I live in a house that, it's an old house, actually. I love it. The problem is I have 14-foot ceilings. So in the winter, the top 7 feet are nice and warm. The bottom 7 feet where I live, not so much.
That's why you need to be paranormal in the winter so you can float in the warm part of the house.
Yeah, well, that's probably not going to happen in this lifetime.
No, I just, I was just thinking of the absurd.
Yeah. So when it gets like to the last couple of days, it got down to in the upper 20s here, which is really very cold for us. So it's like, okay, we sit and we put on the blankets, we bring the cats and sit them on our laps, and we put on just about every single piece of clothing we have.
Yeah, no, and that's the way that you have to go. And until I lived in Dublin, this was like in 96, 97, I had no concept I was like, well, it's just raining.
Oh, no, 40 degrees and rain is miserable. Yeah.
Miserable. I mean, in Dublin, it was like miserable cold. Like you were never warm, even with the heat on.
Yeah.
One of the things that your latest Micky Knight book.
That's not out yet. That will be out in April. Yes.
Yes. But I'm gonna I'll release this close to the time when people can actually buy it. I just wanted to strike while the iron was hot, as in when I just finished reading it. One of the things that I found fascinating about the structure of this book was it took you to a certain point until you were doing the archival research, or Micky was doing the archival research. But then there are 2 plot lines that were not quite parallel, but had similarities as you'd learn about like the dumb teenagers and all the drama that they were getting into. And then you'd go back in time to like the early turn of the century, and turn of the century meaning the 1900s and whatnot, and see what life was like there first. I didn't even think it was possible to solve a murder, or even plausible for somebody to walk in a PI store and say, well, I'd like you to solve a murder. She's like, well, it's not my thing. You should talk to the police. Well, the person's been dead since like 1907. She's like, oh.
Yeah.
But I had no idea how much you could get through, property stuff and microfiche. Like her eyes must have been bothering her like crazy after doing all that reading. But
well, yes. I mean, there's a little bit of, again, that fictional, because a lot of what she pulls is from a diary from a policeman from the era, and the likelihood of really finding that is not that great, but it's plausible. And my partner is an academic historian, and she actually does a huge amount of historical research back into the 1800s, particularly. So anytime I do that, I'm always like, look, is this reasonable? How would you do this research? What's there? And all this sort of stuff. So it is, and it's a lot of what detectives actually do is they pull through all sorts of pieces of paper to finally put that story together. And a lot of what she does is, again, it's a fictional book, but it is within the realm of what's possible. What you really can pull out of records.
I love how I'm following the story and I'm like, wow, that modern guy is a real asshole. It seems like the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Ugh.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to do parallel stories that echoed each other, but without, without that they actually linked up in a plot significant way. Because life often doesn't give you those kind of coincidences. But I do think there's an echoing in what each of the stories tells us, particularly about the treatment of women, and how do people react, back then and today, and what's changed and what hasn't changed.
One of the things that I liked best, this was at the end of the novel, was how this has to be a Trumpian line. No one has more respect for women than I do.
Oh yeah, I pulled that one. I think that one had come up recently, and I'm just like, yeah, that's again, writing is influenced by what we live in and that sort of stuff. And that was when all the guys would say, well, I really respect women. I put them up on a pedestal, and I was like, no.
I liked it because you said, I don't, I'm not looking for respect. I'm looking for equality.
Yeah.
Whether it's a pedestal or a pit, which I thought was like a great juxtaposition. Mm-hmm. And that was pretty much it, that we're seen as less human.
Right. Yeah, the wonderful line from Simone de Beauvoir, that feminism is the radical notion that women are human too. And that encompasses all of humanity. It's not that we're, more emotional or we're more this or more... It's everything. We can be everything. We can be every single inch of humanity. And until we reach that, then we're never going to be everything we can be. And I don't think we're there yet. Clearly, I think that this current, what's happened in the presidential election shows us how far we have to go in terms of women's equality.
One of the things that I was thinking about for the last two, like the shoals of time, and also I'm thinking about people coming into her place of business and after having done a background check on her. And there are times at which I wondered, did they see, because all the crazy ass shit that happened in the first few books and all how come those things don't pop up in somebody's research of her? Because some of the things that happened to her were just so over the edge of crazy and scary and dangerous.
Yeah. Well, again, this is fiction. It has to hew to what's possible in real life, but there's also this, first of all, time has passed. She's gotten to be older. So I've tried to keep them sort of realistic. I know in some ways I'm sort of stretching time too, but it's not like she goes out and has one of these dangerous things where someone tries to kill her, every single year or every 6 months or so.
I'm grateful that you don't shoot her at the end of each book.
Yeah.
Because there are some police procedurals, or there's this one series that I just stopped reading, and I won't say who wrote it or whatnot, but I stopped reading. I was like, I really can't handle you shooting her again.
No, those things, the thing too is that does damage. You don't always recover from that kind of stuff. And how does it affect people as they go on? I've tried to be realistic about violence, and it's dangerous, it's scary, you can't control it. Yeah, I mean, these are books, and of course I can control it. In real life you can't. But to be in that world, if she's in that world where it's like you don't want to get into violence, because when people get hurt, they get hurt, and there's no way to know how to do it. So I've tried to be, again, realistic that, if she gets, the time she did get shot, she was in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So I've tried to keep that within the realm of stuff. But again, she works as a private investigator, and I've tried at least to convey that she's probably a pretty good one.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry to interrupt, because damn you if I lost my thought just to interrupt you with it.
Yeah.
Oh, no, now I remember it. One of the things that I like that has, as you said, hewn to what is possible and plausible is, even though she can fight and she has, a martial arts background and lots of experience, um, you can sense that almost every fight that she could kind of lose. Something really bad can happen. She's not one of those universally, and not infallible, but like, oh, I'm incredibly talented at fighting and there's never any concern. She's like, well, I go for like the solar plexus and the poor male body part gets yanked and whatnot fairly often. But what I like about her is that even though she's street smart and she knows how to fight, there's still like the reality of what's possible and the size of the person that she's going up against, and like what kind of state is her personal body in at the time when she's trying to defend herself.
Well, and you know, first of all, there's a reality of it. You know, violence is uncontrollable. It's unpredictable. People get hurt in ways they didn't anticipate being hurt. And the thing is, too, as a writer, the higher you make the stakes, I think the more you engage the reader and pull them in. And you know, my books have been fairly, you know, hardcore. Is things happen. Things happen to people you may end up liking in the book, and they don't always make it through the entire book. And without that kind of tension, that it you know, when you read, say, a cozy book, you know that nothing really bad is going to happen to anybody. And you know, readers sometimes want to live in that world, in that covenant that the writer makes with the reader. And I've tried to make it clear, you know, I'm a writer who, my covenant with you is I'm going to tell the best story that I can, but I'm not going to really pull too many punches. This is the mean streets, and the streets can be very mean.
I like one of the relationships, especially with, I guess, the way that the last book ended, is her relationship with Joanne. And earlier on in the series, like, they had an affair. And what was interesting was the reason why, one of the reasons why Joanne liked being with Micky, because Micky had a very fucked up childhood, just like she had, and they both see very dark things in their daily life, whereas Alex, which is Joanne's girlfriend at the time, came from a fairly easy, you know, idyllic experience compared to what the two of them had. But they weren't, like, Joanne and Micky were never going to be a good couple. She joked, I guess, at one point that what we're going to, like, you know, outbutch each other, or, you know, be, you know, they...
Yeah, I think she said the sparks flew, but they always went in the wrong direction.
Yes. And even though, like, from the outside, even from Alex's perspective and sometimes other people's perspective, they would think that they were more finely matched, but what they really needed was somebody a little more stable and a little less dark to kind of help them through. And then, you know, just seeing there's this point at the end of the last book where Joanne is showing in very few words exactly why she loves Micky as a friend and finds her to be an extraordinary person. And since that's not something that's normally going to roll off Joanne's tongue, because she's, you know, she's terse, she has her glasses on, and so you can't always see what she's thinking, and, you know, sometimes she's such a hard ass and you never know what's going on in her mind. But I thought it was a very salient moment to kind of see, for a person who doesn't talk a lot and doesn't give a lot of compliments or anything like that, for Micky to be really seen by her. I really liked that.
Yeah, that was the second ending that I wrote. You know, because we struggle with the endings. Is what kind of note do I want this book to end on? And there's actually a great line that Virginia Woolf said about Jane Austen. She said, Jane Austen never omitted an obligatory scene. And I went back and thought about this book and thought about how did I want to end it. And I realized I need to have the penultimate moment with Micky and Joanne. You know, because they've been there's some clashing going on in this book, The Girl on the Edge of Summer, between the two of them, and I need to see them one more time, and that has to be the end of the book.
And, you know, it wasn't, well, not the obligatory thing, but because you don't have those moments in the series, for it to be there, you know, there's reason behind it. There's there's a reason why it ends the way it does, and you have those moments with her. And I kind of needed that from the point where things were dicey with Cordelia into, into the last few books. And so I kind of needed that moment where, Micky has somebody in her life that gets her,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we all need our friends. We all need our support system. And, Mickey sometimes, I try to bring that duality. She can be a real jerk, but she also can be capable of incredible generosity. She can really, when the chips are down, she's the kind of person you want in your corner, because she's going to be smart, she's going to be loyal, she's going to be funny, she's going to do what she can for you. She's not so good at some of the stuff where it's not necessary that she be there. She can be a jerk then, but to show that duality and to recognize, because I think one of the things that I recognize as I get older is when you're in your 20s, the person that tells the fun joke and is popular is the person you hang around with. As you get older, it's like, no, I want the person who is reliable, who I can really trust to be there, who is, even though they're a flawed person, there's still there's that intelligence, there's the creativity, there's the kindness and the compassion. All these things, are much more important than the popular person.
One of the, it's not a trope, but when Cordelia realizes that one of the reasons why it was most easy for her to go the straight and narrow and to behave honorably and to be the uber, loyal girlfriend, wife type, was because she never was truly tested.
Yeah. Well, we all get tested through circumstances, and one of the things I was trying to work on in these last couple books is sometimes this is not a good answer. There's bad answers and there's worst answers, and we try and do the best we can, seeing what we see. I wanted to create a situation for the two of them that it really was just there weren't good answers. That the things that Micky did, there were reasons for them, but they were also reasons that did not work for where Cordelia was, even though we're hearing it through Micky's view, so it's much harder to convey what was going on for Cordelia. But particularly as you read this book, to realize that there just wasn't, there were no good answers, and life sometimes gives that to you. And how do you behave in those situations? And particularly, how do you behave in those situations when you realize what you did wasn't what you wanted to do? And looking back at what happened, you would have wished you had chosen differently, but you also know you did the best you could at the time with what you knew and what you were predicting in the future. And we all go through that. We all have moments. I think in one of the books, there's a line I've always, I wrote it, yes, but I always kind of liked it, where I think it was Danny who says, we'd do the right thing if we knew what it was. Mm-hmm. And that's the heartbreak of life, is sometimes we don't know what the right thing is. Sometimes we have these choices with, they have positives and losses, and so we have to sort of choose, not knowing what's going to be around the next corner and what that choice is going to make. There oftentimes are not perfect answers.
One of the lines that I think it was in the second to last book, it was in the Shoals of Time, where there are bad choices and worse choices. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes, that is what life is. And those of us who have okay choices, in the context of that, I think it was Micky was looking at one of the hotels,
yes,
on Tulane Avenue, where it's what they're known as hooker hotels. It's an area that is rapidly gentrifying and changing, though. But it's like, what brings people to those places? And you look and say, probably there weren't great choices. And those of us who don't have to make those kind of choices live in a different world. And I think one of the things to recognize is oftentimes people get caught. They get caught in circumstances. They get caught, it's one disease, one bad choice, one lost job, a broken down truck. And all these things can conspire together to put you in places where suddenly you don't have good choices. And we need to recognize that sometimes is that, yeah, well, maybe back when you were 12 years old, you should have studied more and gone to school, but you didn't. And now how do you get out of those really bad choices?
What surprised me with Micky when she was in that charming hooker hotel, and when she was like not only contemplating the prostitute that she's talking to, but she's also thinking about the madam that was in the quarter, was she saw them as either having, the line is from the other woman, but having bad choices and worse choices. And to me, I feel that Micky's life was a lot like that. I didn't think that she was as many steps away as she thought she did. She said, well, I can't judge people because of all the choices and decisions that I've made. And I felt in my head, I'm like, you're really, really splitting hairs because you're not as far away from that person as you think you are. And then in the most recent book with the life of women in like the late 1800s to early 1900s was, if you didn't have a husband or a family member or whatever to look after you, there weren't a lot of choices on how to make a living. And Ali Bay, is that how it was supposed to be pronounced?
Yeah, Ali Bay Bro.
Ali Bay Bro. Okay.
Yeah.
That this is the wife of the journalist, as in the cop who's writing a journal. And she was very aware of the frailty of her position, and he said it never had occurred to him that would be something that she would be concerned about. But life was a lot more liminal for women than for men.
Yeah. Well, and it also would depend on what class you were. Mm-hmm. We forget these sort of things. I mean, even today, that certainly carries through. But if you were a genteel woman, there were a few professions open to you, school teacher, governors, that sort of stuff. But if you were a lower class woman, you were often considered a public woman in that you were available to men. The upper class women, the genteel women, the respectable women were not available to men. The women that did laundry and stuff were available. The servant girl could be impregnated by the master, and she was the one that suffered for it. Mm-hmm. He suffered nothing for it. And keep that in mind as well. I'm not giving a whole way of plot, but this area revolves around Storyville, or as they called it, the district, which was a legal red light district in what's now sort of the back part of the quarter and into the Treme. Around from 1896 to 1917, and literally they had some, very high class, quote unquote, houses on the main strip, Basin Street, and then if you go further and further back, you get to what they actually called them the cribs. This is what they were called back at the time, of little shacks where women would service the dock workers, the lower class men. But it was this whole legal contained district because they wanted to create a vice district. And so what would take women into that? Why did women fall into that? And then what happened to those women? Because oftentimes those kind of women, even today, are invisible.
Mm-hmm. It's like the throwaway women, the women that...
Yeah.
I also, one of the things that I got, from reading your last book, and also I was thinking about a book that Andy Marquette had written about, like, kind of working on the Sleepy Hollow as a base story, and then kind of teasing out something from there. It really gave me a romantic idea of looking in the archives and discovering things, and the way that I imagined it was almost like the treasure hunts that I used to do in my house when I was a kid.
Yeah.
looking for something, magical and wonderful. And I did live in an old house. Like it was a brownstone that, like at this point, is about 130, 140 years old. So I always thought I was going to find some great treasure. So it was fun to go through the banal and the boring to this is really amazing piece of information. I also like that you had not you, but Micky had a hard time telling the difference between a lesbian and a librarian.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, that's Micky for you, I guess her bias is she thinks intelligent women are likely to be lesbians.
The other thing that, one last note before we finish, the other thing that I felt was probably unintentionally true to life is from Micky's perspective, she was much more cautious about being out and determining what was a safe environment for her to not let her freak flag fly. But I was thinking about the times when I was in New Orleans, parallel to the times that she was living, and my impression of what was safe and comfortable was very different than hers. But it was her worldview came out, from I guess the 80s and the 90s and whatnot.
Well, she's and I think she says it, referring to, for example, Joanne or Danny. Joanne's on the police force, Danny's in a district attorney or, in the district attorney's office. That for them being out is much more problematic. Micky's always been pretty much out within who she is within her circle of friends, which is true for the entire time of New Orleans. But this is a city in the South. It is surrounded by the Republican suburbs. There's a suburb not that far, right out of the city where David Duke was elected to the state legislature. So that there are those kind of people out there. So it's not like New York City where you're basically surrounded with New Jersey and Connecticut and all these really blue states. It's New Orleans. It's this little blue island surrounded by seas of red. And so you recognize that there are places out there that really are actively hostile to people who are gay. And so Micky just recognizes that for in the French Quarter, her friends, among this, she's fine being out, and she's pretty out. But there are a few places where maybe she needs not to, she needs to just sort of keep that quiet. And that's some of what she does as a private eye, and I think some of what we all do when she's professional, it's what's important professional. My day job is in AIDS and HIV, and there are times that I am perfectly comfortable saying, hey, I'm a lesbian, and there are times where it's really not. It's not appropriate. It's not called for. There's no reason to do it, and so I don't. And she's that same sort of way. In the professional setting, she makes decisions. And like we all do, if there's a situation where you really feel it's unsafe, I sort of joke, my partner and I joke, because she doesn't live here. She's an academic. She has academic, she's tenured elsewhere. And we drive through Mississippi, and I'm always like, look, if we ever really get into a situation, I will pull out that Mississippi accent, and I'll just, oh, honey, we had to cut her hair. She got that bubble gum all caught up in her hair, and it's such beautiful hair, and we just had to cut it all off. It broke my heart. Bless her heart. I will do that if we feel unsafe. And it's sad that we have to joke about it, but it is really true.
It is.
And again, I think this election has made us much more aware of, and made it much more acceptable for that kind of violence and that kind of hate to be out there.
Yeah, even as blue as New Jersey is, I live in a barrier island. It sounds much more exotic, but basically it was a sandbar that eventually became big enough for people to live on. And I've always felt that I can't describe it anything other than extreme tolerance, where you feel that you're being tolerated. But the majority of the people who live where I live full time, because mostly people live in this neighborhood who are tourists, just renting for the summer, is that most of them are elderly. They're very conservative. The majority of the locals stations, like, if you put your radio on scan, the majority of them are, different elevations of holy rollers. And I've been wondering how long it will take for that tolerance to thin.
Yeah. Yeah. And see, I live in a neighborhood, I live in Louisiana, which is, red, red, red. But it's a mixed neighborhood. My neighbor next door is a straight woman, and we've been fine. There's a black guy and his family across the street. He's been, we've been neighbors for a long time. He's done some repairs on my house. I'm not paying for it, of course, but things like, and then we'll take him some bread or some beer and stuff like that. So it's always been really neighborly. It's been a neighborhood that's been integrated in multiple different ways, from black and white to gay and straight. And it's just one of those New Orleans neighborhoods where it's, if you're good people, you're good people. It doesn't matter who you are, because we're, my partner and I, she's down here right now, we're fine talking to all the people in the neighborhood. I remember one time there was a second line going on here, and traffic was all backed up, and so my partner was driving in, and they're like, "Oh, you gotta go." And then our neighbor came out, and he's like, "No, she lives here," and started directing traffic so she could come in and get parked in front of her house. That's the kind of neighborhood we live in. And, it's one of the reasons I'm like, yes, I will live in my bubble. Thank you very much. Because this is the kind of world I want to live in.
Yeah, I lived more in that world when I was still living in Hoboken. This is a bit of a change, but
yeah.
So I want to thank you for for being my debut. And we managed not to mangle too many storylines on my part. So people, I definitely suggest that you go to Bold Strokes Books, which is the happy home for all of Jean's novels in the series, and so you can pick them up there. Is there anything you'd like to tell my listeners?
Right, yes. It's The Girl on the Edge of Summer. Yeah, and I had to pick that title actually a fairly long time ago, before every other book was named A Girl on Something. And in my defense, not to give anything away, but I'm not referring to adult women as girls. So that was one of the reasons that my editor suggested it. Yes, so buy books. You don't have to buy my books, but buy books, read. Because reading is, I think, one of the ways that we fight back against isolation and encompass different ways we can be. And we need those books out there that tell our stories. And so, again, I just encourage everyone, go read a book.
Exactly. Read a book, read lots of books, be passionate about it. And I know for me, I'm also going to speak to people who review books. If you feel like you're getting burnt out, take a break and read what you like. And I'll be honest that I created the series because I wanted to take back my power and read something that I knew that I'd love. And I encountered your books when I first started my lesbian reading binge, a couple decades ago.
Yeah, we are.
And it actually has changed my experience and my view and my enjoyment level, because I had the agency of choosing a series that I knew that I liked, so there was no question of whether or not I was going to open a book and go, "Oh shit, I have to review this. I hate it." So it was truly selfish and enjoyable on my part. And one of the things that I think is valuable about good fiction and Jean writes good fiction is that you can read it more than once, and each time you read it, as you grow older, your worldview changes a bit, so you experience it differently. And one of the things that I liked about Micky was because she was fucked up. She was bent. She was broken in some ways, but she kept clawing forward. And sometimes in life you have to keep clawing forward. So it's nice to read a book about like somebody who's kept on keeping on. So I really enjoyed that, and I'm glad that you came on and speak with me.
Well, thank you. Well, one of the things that interests me is, how do flawed people, and Micky, I want to make Micky very flawed, how do flawed people look for something like justice? And that's what I want to write about. We're messed up, we're screwy, but how do we keep going toward the light?
Mhm.
So listen, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed the books. I'm particularly, I know you enjoy this series, but I also know I had this next one coming out. And as a writer, we write books, and it's always just jumping off a cliff. You never know where you're going to end. You never know what are you going to really be able to put the words that you want to put on the page.